Hey, third graders, welcome back. We're going to continue reading from Living Through a Natural Disaster. If you remember yesterday, we talked about Cyclone Tracy happening in Australia, and we said we don't really experience cyclones in Michigan, right? Or hurricanes, which they're known as in our hemisphere, we're in the northern hemisphere. But we're going to read today about the Huang He flood. And here's a great map of China that shows us where this is located. We have floods in Michigan, right? You might have seen it in the news. You might have experienced one yourself, maybe not to this extent, obviously, but we had a pretty big flood in Midland, Michigan recently that really wiped out a lot of people's homes. So there's some connection to our area. So let's read a little bit about the Huang He flood. The Huang He winds its way down from the mountainous region in the heart of China. The river then meanders eastward across the vast North China Plain before emptying into the Yellow Sea. So they show you exactly where that river is. And I love that they used some really great descriptive words. Meanders, right? That means it winds. A mountainous region. The lower section of the river often floods the flat plains, making that region a dangerous place to live. However, the flooding brings riches as well as disaster. The floods leave behind a layer of silt, making the plains fertile. The crops grown there feed millions of people. In 1933, the Huang He proved once again that it was a danger that could not be ignored. It unleashed a terrible flood that swept through towns, villages, and farmland. It killed thousands of people and left millions homeless. Here's a picture, and it says the flood forced people to flee by boat. So there they are going down the street, but not right in cars. They are riding in boats to evacuate. Remember, this is in 1933. The Yellow River. Huang He means yellow river in Chinese. The river takes its name from the tons of yellow-colored silt that it collects on its journey through the river gorges before it reaches the plains. It is this silt that is so fertile and that nourishes the surrounding land when the river floods. The silt settles on the riverbed, and as it builds up, the level of the water is raised. In times of heavy rain, the river overflows its banks, flooding the region. For hundreds of years, the people who lived along the Huang He tried to find ways to control the frequent river floods. They dug out the silt and built canals to direct the water elsewhere. However, the silt continued to cause the level of the riverbed to rise. Over the years, the higher riverbed raised the level of the water in the river. In some places, the water flowed along a riverbed of mud that was more than 15 feet above the level of the surrounding plains. The people finally decided that the best way to stop the river from overflowing was to build up the banks of the river, forming high walls called dikes. As the diagram on the next page shows, this action only made a dangerous situation even worse. So here's a great big double-page picture with a great caption. So you can see these people, and you can tell that it's kind of tinted yellow. It says, "This is the muddy yellow Huang He today. At about 3,000 miles long, it is one of the world's longest rivers. Much of the Huang He flows across a very flat region, changing its course from time to time." So it's a very long river. If you think about one side of the United States to the other, it's really, really long. Let's look at what is a flood. In that little fact box there, it says there are two basic types of river flood. A regular flood happens when the water level slowly rises, then overflows its banks. A more dangerous flash flood happens when a great amount of rain falls in a short time, causing a wall of water to suddenly rush over an area. Human activity can cause floods. Soil and vegetation absorb rain. When trees are cut down and the land is covered with buildings and roads, rain cannot be absorbed into the soil. Instead, It runs off into ditches and storm sewers. If there is heavy rain, water can overflow these places, causing a flood. Now, in my class, we talked about some of that during Earth Day and during Arbor Day recently, how important trees are not only for the air, but for the land as well. So here's that chart that we're talking about. This is heavy rain. A rainy season in central China occurs every June and July. In June 1933, the farmers strengthened the dikes as they did each year. However, the rains in July were so heavy that the water overflowed the dikes in some places. People worked as fast as they could to build the dikes higher. So here is an example, a graph of how the Huanghe became so high. So if you look at these pictures, right, there's trees on the side, and it says silt collected on the riverbed, pushing up the water level. During heavy rain, the water spilled over the banks. So there's a picture of that. Okay, then farmers built dikes along the riverbanks. The dikes usually stop the river from flowing out onto surrounding fields. So you can see, right, they built up the sides to keep that water contained, whereas up here, that yellow is spilling over onto the land where the trees are. Okay, and then finally, for number 3, as more silt built up, the water kept rising. Farmers built the dikes higher, and the water level became dangerously high. So the silt down here is building up, right, and it's pushing that water up as well. As the weeks passed, the rain kept falling, and the river level continued to rise. A huge amount of water now flowed along its high riverbed above the farmland, villages, and towns on the plains. The swiftly moving water pounded the walls of the dikes until they could no longer withstand the force. The dikes began to break. People frantically tried to repair the gaps, plugging them with bundles of kaoling stalks, rocks, and earth. The rushing water kept pulling away more and more material from the dikes, making the gaps even wider. So here's a picture that says, today, the dikes along many of China's rivers are reinforced with a crisscross of steel pipes. So right in here. This is what they used. It says kaoliang. In the past, dikes were made mainly of bundles of kaoliang stalks, a grain that grows on the North China Plain. Kaoliang, which is also called Chinese sorghum, has been an important building material and food crop in China for thousands of years. Its seeds, or grain, are used for animal feed. Okay, so here's a picture of maize, which is kind of like corn, and then right next to it is that kaoliang. So it looks a little bit kind of like Indian corn, in my opinion. A little bit different. So those are some Chinese crops. The Huanghe overflows. Under increasing pressure, many of the river dikes collapsed without warning. Water rushed through more than 1,000 breaks, some a mile wide. The entire river emptied onto the plains, creating a huge flood of muddy, swirling water. People fled for their lives, but thousands drowned in the massive waterfalls that poured down from the high banks of the river. Some people survived by climbing trees and rooftops. They waited in these high places, enduring hunger, thirst, and the pouring rain, hoping to be rescued. Other people fled by boat. They gathered whatever possessions they could and desperately paddled away from the flooded areas. As they escaped, they tried to rescue anyone who was stranded. After the floodwaters retreated, that means they went down, went back to normal, homes that were not washed away were buried under a thick covering of mud. More than 3 million people were left homeless and had to dig in the mud to find scraps of material to rebuild their houses. The crops on the plains had also been ruined, bringing starvation and famine to thousands. So here, make this a little bit bigger. You can see how high the water is, right? These are buildings. These are the roofs of buildings. It says waters of the Huang He flooded about 4,500 square miles of farmland, villages, and towns. So remember, square miles. So thinking about inside of an area was 4,500 miles. So not long, but square. These pictures at the top here say in the towns, streets became rivers along which people fled in flat-bottomed boats called sampans. So you can see them. Remember, they're not leaving on the road. The road is now turned into a waterway, and they're leaving and evacuating in a boat. Imagine how they might feel. The Huang He today. To prepare for future floods, trees and other vegetation were planted along the river. Plants help to absorb rainfall and to reduce soil erosion that washes silt into the river. However, many people who live along the Huang He are faced with a different problem today. After decades of drought, deforestation, and mismanagement, some parts of the Huang He are nearly dry. Since local people, farms, and industries rely on the river for their water supply, this situation is causing huge problems. Du Paian is the manager of a copper factory in the city of Taiyuan. He explained how the lack of water was affecting his workers. Some of our employees have had no water for days. They can't clean their homes. They can only take showers once a week. To deal with the low water levels, the government has begun to dig wells and provide money for better irrigation systems. It is considered building canals to bring water to the Huang He from the Jiangxing, the Yangtze River. However, this project would be very expensive and may not provide the needed amount of water. It says today some parts of the Huang He are almost dry. So you can see the dry land. So floods are definitely something that can happen in Michigan. Tomorrow we're going to read about El Nino and drought. Okay, and you'll notice on the map, this is Central America. We live in North America, and then South America is down here, so it connects our two continents.